अस्सलाम वालेकुम नाज़रीन, सिंध टेलीविजन न्यूज़ जे पारां मां आहियां मुंहिंजो मेज़बान फ़याज़ नाइच। अॼु के ॾींहुं असां मौजूदु आहियूं हिते वॉशिंगटन पोस्ट में, जिते मारूफ़ जेको आहे पंहिंजो दानिश्वर ऐं सहाफ़ी डेविड इग्नोशियस असां गॾु आहे, छो त हुन सां गुफ़्तगू कयूं। डेविड, थैंक यू वेरी मच फॉर गिविंग अस टाइम। वेल, हाउ डू यू सी द Obama administration's foreign policy, because it is almost on the end of their tenure?
The Obama administration has had some significant successes. I would rate the nuclear agreement with Iran as a significant success. The president, from his first day in office, in his inaugural address, said he wanted to do this. He worked hard and strategically to achieve it, and I think most people now judge it to have been a success. Opening relations with Cuba, a country that the United States had had an embargo with for 50 years, opens the way for much better relations for the U.S. and Latin America. That's a good thing. In the Middle East, I think it's fair to say that the president's policies have been badly unsuccessful. The president has been allergic, wanting to avoid U.S. military involvement in Syria. He's been forced by events to do things that he didn't want to do. We have a problem of ISIS that has grown and grown. ISIS now has roots in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia. It has roots across the Middle East and North Africa. The president's desire to stay out of the conflict in Syria was understandable. We're a country that has experienced these two really unsuccessful wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. But looking back, it seems clear that not getting involved early carried a big price. Syria is now shattered. ISIS is now under attack and is finally being pushed back. But in the meantime, we've had a pressure of migration that has made Europe unstable. We've just seen something we would have thought unimaginable, Britain leaving the European Union. So I think these will all be parts of what I think historians will judge a mixed legacy. I think that they will conclude that the basic idea that Obama had, that the United States can step back from the Middle East, was not successful. As we step back, other people step forward. ISIS stepped forward. Iran stepped forward. Saudi Arabia stepped forward. Most important, perhaps, Russia stepped forward. So I think the legacy there will be negative.
And what about Russia, Obama's foreign policy towards Russia? Because, as you say, that they have a step forward in Middle East and they have a very offensive role in the Ukraine issue.
In Obama's first term, he put a big emphasis on what he called the reset with Russia. This was back when Dmitry Medvedev was the president and Putin was out of the picture. And the U.S. was very optimistic that over time a better relationship with Russia was possible. When Putin came back, he came back really with a vengeance. He came back convinced the United States was trying to destabilize Russia, that the United States had sought regime change in so many countries with very negative consequences. So Putin has been aggressive. And the Obama administration, to the day we're talking, to right now, has not really known what to do with this more aggressive Russia of Vladimir Putin. The administration was upset, it applied sanctions after Putin invaded Crimea and began destabilizing Ukraine, but always thought, let's leave an exit ramp so that the Russians, when they come to their senses, when they realize that this is too costly for them, can find their way back to a normal relationship. It hasn't happened. The administration was caught by surprise when Putin sent troops to Syria. Russia now, having sent these military forces, I think has the decisive role in Syria. And Putin is making his case. We are not going to accept repeated regime change. We're going to stick by Bashar al-Assad and make sure he stays in power. So I think Putin's ability to play a weak hand, Russia is not a strong country. Economically, culturally, in most ways, it's a country that's really suffering weakness. Putin has been able to play that weak hand brilliantly. And I think Obama has not known what the right strategy was for containing, combating, working with, whatever strategy you choose. None of them have worked.
4 years back, we were there in Washington, D.C., and we were talking about the foreign policy, and you said that not only this tenure, but in for decades, that China will be the most fundamental or most first priority of the US foreign policy for any president. How do you see the Obama dealing with China?
Obama announced that he was going to pivot to Asia after his frustrations in the Middle East and put more emphasis on China. That pivot has been very limited in terms of the actual forces that were moved. But I think more important, China has continued, even accelerated the pace of its activities that challenged U.S. Dominance in Asia. First, it was in the East China Sea near Japan, and the Chinese asserted sovereignty over some contested islands. The U.S. was fairly strong in its response to that, and the Chinese pulled back. Japan is now more strong and serious military power than it's been at any time since 1945. Then the issue was the South China Sea, and the Chinese began, in effect, creating new islands, creating new outposts that someday can be used for military power, to project Chinese power in that area. The United States has said that it wants these things to be settled by international arbitration. It's stood by Southeast Asian countries like the Philippines, Vietnam. So China is unpopular in the region. The United States has said that it regards these as threatening moves, but the Chinese keep going. So I think this is a period where Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, you'd have to say, looking at the most effective leaders in the world in terms of projecting power, they would be Xi, probably first, and Vladimir Putin in Russia second.
And where you rate Obama in this context?
Well, I think on the things that Obama worked hardest on, So first, the Iran nuclear deal, I think, is positive. Second, it is true that the United States, which was so unpopular in the world after George W. Bush, is less unpopular. It may be less feared, it may be less respected as a military power, but it's not as unpopular. I think Barack Obama is seen as a thoughtful man. It's still revolutionary that we have this African American who's served 2 terms as president. He's an honest man. He has a good family. He has good values. I think people in the United States and around the world see that in a positive way. It's very interesting. As we speak, Obama's popularity rating is 56%. At its lowest point, it was down in the 20s. George W. Bush, when he left office, was down in the 20s and 30s. So Obama is going to leave office, it looks, as a popular president, but not necessarily a strong or decisive one.
South Asia, it looks that the containing China, the American foreign policy is focusing on India. How do you see the foreign policy in South Asia?
So I think it's right to say that one product of the Obama years is a stronger U.S.-India relationship that began under President Bush, but it's continued and accelerated. Prime Minister Modi and President Obama seem to have a personal chemistry that's powerful, and that's added to the momentum for the relationship. I think the most important test of the United States' future in South Asia is what the President will decide to do with the level of troops in Afghanistan. By the time he leaves office, he is supposed to, by his earlier timetable, reduce that number from nearly 10,000 to about 5,000, basically cut the number in half. I'm hearing increasingly from U.S. military commanders that they think he won't do that, that the situation in Afghanistan is still so unstable. The situation in neighboring Pakistan is still so complicated for the United States that the idea of sharply cutting troops and leaving another place, I think increasingly seems unwise to the White House. The U.S.-Pakistan relationship through these years of the Obama presidency, I would say, has been like a sine curve. It went way up and then it went down. Now it's kind of balanced out. There's less public attention focused on it. I know that the Pakistani government was very upset when the U.S. Killed Mullah Mansour within Baluchistan, within Pakistani territory. That was another bump to the relationship. But I find in talking to Pakistani officials that in this less visible, less public, less noisy relationship, there's more business that's being done.
So, do you think that Obama administration or the U.S. administration is trying to deal in Pakistan fairly?
I think the U.S.
Because there are a lot of complaints from Pakistani administration on F-16 and all those things, and the continuous warfare and continuous drone attacks.
I think for the U.S. and Pakistan, the last 7 years, the years of Obama, have been very difficult. The relationship has been under enormous strain. You could say that at a time when al-Qaeda had taken refuge within Pakistani territory after the 9/11 bombing, that it was inevitable that there was going to be friction and difficulty. I think American military officials in the White House have been very pleased to see the performance of the Chief of Army Staff, General Raheel. He's seen as having been a very effective Chief of Army Staff. He does what he says he's going to do. His intervention in North Waziristan and Miram Shah was seen here as decisive, well executed. His willingness to bring the Pakistani military more into play in Karachi to reduce the level of violence there. Again, people look at that and they admire that. So I think in that sense, in a time when Pakistan is taking more responsibility independent of U.S. views or assistance for its own security, the view here in Washington is that that's well done. The U.S.-Pakistan relationship is so hard to know how to get it right. It's been frustrating for both countries. As someone who cares about Pakistan, would love to see better U.S.-Pakistani relations, I've watched this period of difficulty with regret, but you never can be sure what would make it better. And I think that's felt on both the U.S. and Pakistan sides. As I said earlier, one thing that I'm learning is that when there's less of a media spotlight, when you know, it's less a daily news story in Islamabad or in Washington, that may make it easier for the relationship to go forward.
So do you foresee that in the coming years, when there will be change of administration in the United States, there will be change, a meaningful change in U.S. relations?
So, you know, I think the hope that Americans would have is that as India's relations with Pakistan improve and there are strong trade and even political links in South Asia, it will be easier for the United States to embrace India and Pakistan together, not feel that it's having to choose sides. So in a sense, I think that's the core interest of the United States, a better India-Pakistan relationship, reduced tensions between the two countries, make it easier for balance in our relationship. I know that Pakistanis worry that the U.S. has become so strongly pro-India and that has left Pakistan behind, and what happened to our traditional alliance. We always thought of the U.S. and Pakistan as military allies. I think going forward with the next administration, we'll have to see what the policies are. Secretary Clinton knows Pakistan well. She's visited there often. She has a deep investment, I think, in a stronger U.S.-Pakistan relationship. But again, I have a feeling that the key lies in the decisions that Pakistan makes about its own interests, its own security interests, its economic interests, and whether they argue for greater ties with India. If that's what Pakistan decides, the future looks pretty easy, I think, in terms of the U.S.-Pakistan relationship.
I remember one thing, that when Obama was running for his candidacy in 2004, he in his speech he said that he will going to take efforts to normalize or to resolve the Kashmir issue between India and Pakistan. But unfortunately, in both of his tenures, he has not taken such initiatives. I personally think that because of the pressure of India. What do you think, that America can play a role to normalize relations between India and Pakistan?
Certainly the U.S. can encourage a Kashmir settlement, but as we've seen, the impetus for that has to come from India and Pakistan. President Musharraf, when he was president in Pakistan, got very close, as we remember, to finding a Kashmir formula that both sides could live with. we've seen in more recent years continued exploration, discussion of what might be possible, ways of reducing the level of tension on the way to some sort of better resolution of the problem. My sense is that that's something that Nawaz Sharif would like to do if he could, but it's not his top priority. And Kashmir is one of those problems that we've tended in Washington to see as being in the too hard pile, except in those moments when, in particular in Pakistan, as under President Musharraf, there is a willingness to think creatively, think out of the box about a way to resolve that. And so, again, my own answer as an observer would be, this is really in the hands of Islamabad and Pakistani politicians, and if there's movement there towards discussions with India in secret, probably, the United States would support them.
Most of the analysts say that without the resolution of Kashmir issue and the Palestine issue, it is not possible that non-state actors phenomena in the Muslim countries is not to be dealt properly.
I think that the idea that people sometimes have that you can just walk away from these issues, these long-standing grievances, and that someday they'll just go away. People in the Muslim world will forget about the Palestinian issue, let's say. History has shown that that's wrong. I mean, it's understandable why somebody might think that, but it's clearly not true. And the same is true with Kashmir. Kashmir is still an issue. People still feel that it needs to be resolved. And I think the frustration for U.S. Diplomacy is when the U.S. tries its hardest, and you can't fault Secretary of State Kerry for not having tried to do something on the Palestinian issue. I mean, I've never seen a Secretary of State, work more passionately to try to force an agreement through, and he basically got nowhere. I mean, if we were honest, we'd say the situation between the Palestinians and the Israelis, the level of mistrust is probably worse now than it was before Kerry started this latest round. I think the same is true with Kashmir. The ability of the U.S. to force India to make concessions, to force Pakistan to alter, is very limited. The decisions to do that have to come internally, and so I think that's one thing that we all learn again over and over, is that the ability of the United States as a superpower to force settlements of issues that are not yet ripe for settlement in the countries is limited.
So now we were talking about the non-state actors, IS and the Taliban and other militant groups, and that is the key concern of the U.S. policy, security and foreign policy. What do you see the U.S. Policy to deal with these issues is working or not?
To deal with the issues of IS,
Taliban and all those non-state actors.
So on one level, obviously it's not working. In March 2014, IS swept into Mosul, shocking the administration, which had been downplaying this issue. And President Obama said we are going to degrade and ultimately destroy the Islamic State. 2 years later, the Islamic State now has branches in 40 countries nominally. It's spread to North Africa. It's a big power in Libya. It's an increasing power in Afghanistan. So in that sense, it's gone the opposite direction of what the United States wanted. In the limited initial battle space of Syria and Iraq, based on what I've seen traveling there, and I was in Iraq twice in the last month, and I was actually inside Syria with U.S. military forces, that campaign is going better. I mean, the Islamic State is being rolled up. It was kicked out of Ramadi, a bloody fight. It is now being pushed out of Fallujah. So the Euphrates Valley in Iraq is increasingly coming under control of forces that the U.S. has supported. The U.S. has found Sunni Arab allies to work with. Same thing is happening in eastern Syria. I traveled to northern Syria with the commander of CENTCOM, General Joseph Hotel, and saw our military advisors working with Syrian Arabs, Syrian Kurds who were taking the fight to Raqqa, the Islamic State's capital, to Shadadi, which is just east of Raqqa, now to Manbij, which is on the Turkish-Syrian border. And in each of those fights, they seem to be having success in squeezing the Islamic State and taking them down. I'm not sure it's going to be finished before Obama leaves as president, but we can see that this campaign over time is working. The question is what squirts out the edges? I mean, what about the movements that have started in the Sinai, in Libya, in Afghanistan, in Indonesia? How are those taken down? And I think that goes to the question that we all worry about the most, which is young Muslims need to feel that this kind of violence is crazy, that it destroys their world and their futures. And until they decide that, I don't think this problem is going to have a solution. I think we'll have ISIS 2.0, 3.0, 4.0 until young people in the Muslim world say, I have a stake in the future. I have a stake in stability and security. And how much can the U.S. do to affect that? It can do some, but the idea that you sometimes hear that if only the United States led a messaging program, if only we sent out the message against extremism and jihadi groups, everything would be different. I just don't think the United States is a messenger that young Muslims are going to listen to. I think that it's got to come internally as people make decisions about the kind of life they want to live.
But most of the analysts say that it was U.S. who worked for change of regimes in the Middle East, especially Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi, and even in the Syria. So that is the reason that all the Middle East is destabilized, and there was a space created by those regime changes, and that was captured by the IS phenomenon.
As big a mistake as I think the invasion of Iraq was, I think it's wrong to think that instability in the Middle East comes from that American intervention. I always have to remind myself that Osama bin Laden and the people who took down the Twin Towers were planning that action before George W. Bush became president. They were teaching themselves how to fly those airplanes in 1999, 2000. That was at a time when the U.S. was seen as trying to solve the Palestinian issue, was not involved in these terrible wars, and yet there was instability. There was instability and violence. Iraq invaded Kuwait. That wasn't something the United States did. It tried to help stop it. Iraq invaded Iran, producing an 8-year war and instability between Iraq and Iran. The Iranian Revolution has, spread instability throughout the region, having nothing to do with the U.S., except the U.S. has been a convenient target for Iranian activity. So I just think the fact is that the Arab world, the Muslim world, is going through a period of transition to something modern and stable. I'm an optimist because I think it's going to get to a place that's much better than what is there today. But the U.S. can influence that and shape it, but we didn't cause it, and we're not going to fix it.
But the governments in Afghanistan, after the U.S. support, with the U.S. support, and Iraq, and even in the Lebanon, Libya, they do not have the capacity to deal with all these non-state actors. Then essentially they depend on the U.S. presence. How do you see that U.S. presence in those areas also supports the non-state actors? They say that these Americans are sitting here, so we are fighting for that cause. So this is a double way.
I think we are unpopular. We're a target. We organize, encourage people to form movements to resist the American presence. Again, this is something I said at different points in this interview. I'm learning that when we do things less visibly, less in the spotlight, less dramatically, quietly, working with friends, we usually are more effective. One thing the United States does pretty well is to use its special operations forces, the best soldiers we have, quietly working with friends in Pakistan, friends in Egypt, friends in, you name the country. But our special operations forces, I think, are active now in over 70 countries in quiet training relationships to build up local special forces so they can deal with problems that arise. And I think that's the kind of thing that countries welcome. The United States is not a visible target, is not encouraging instability, but is helping the leaders of these countries to get stronger and become less vulnerable. The most important area, maybe, in which the U.S. can do this is in Africa. We don't talk much about Africa, but Nigeria is a huge country. It's going to be one of the top 5 in population very soon. And if Nigeria tips toward a kind of radical Islamic movement that sweeps through Central Africa, you have hundreds of millions of people who become potential sources of instability. How should the United States help combat that? The only answer, I think, is to quietly be developing relationships with responsible people in the militaries in countries like Nigeria so that they become stronger, less corrupt, more responsive to what's going on in their countries. But if the United States were to try to send 50,000 troops into Nigeria, obviously we'd be a bigger target.
So the final question, last question, how do you see the both candidates from the Republican and Democratic Party? Whose foreign policy is going to have more vote bank capturing from?
I'm not sure I know what Donald Trump's foreign policy is. Donald Trump's foreign policy is
he will build a wall and he will give.
Yeah, make America great again. One day he suggests he's going to go to war. Another day he's going to let other people do the fighting. He seems to like Putin. He said he'll let Putin take care of Syria. His argument about Asia was let's let Korea and South Korea and Japan have nuclear weapons. They can deal with the China problem. I mean, those are not responsible positions. And if Donald Trump is elected president, you just have to hope that they're not serious positions, because if followed, they lead to a much more dangerous world. Hillary Clinton is somebody who Pakistanis know well. She's visited the country often. She knows your leadership. She's talked to Pakistani audiences. Hillary Clinton isn't perfect. She is not a charismatic leader that her husband was, but she is experienced. And I would think Pakistan would be a good example of why people would feel, well, if she's elected, we still have problems, we want to work on this issue, this issue, this issue, but at least we know that there's somebody here who knows us, has some base of experience to draw on. I think, just as a final thought, it's really important for Clinton, both in terms of getting elected, but also in terms of being able to govern the country, to make the argument clearly to the American people that we have an interest in being in the world, in having our military power be stronger and more respected, in having quiet relationships with our friends around the world, whether it's in Europe, in South Asia. In other words, the idea that the United States can pack up and go home after these years of difficulty, I think is just wrong and dangerous. And I don't think any of our friends, even friends we sometimes have problems with, like Pakistan, I don't think they'd like to see the United States pick up and go home. So, if Clinton, and the polls now suggest that she will be elected, if she's elected, the question is, can she adapt that traditional American internationalism, traditional American foreign policy, so it works better, so that people in Pakistan end up feeling that this is helpful to them and to Pakistani security and not making things worse.
Do you think the Clinton approach towards Middle East She supported Iraq's war. She was Benghazi phenomena. Do you think that in Middle East her thoughts are workable?
Well, I would guess that Clinton, if she becomes president, is going to rethink some of the fundamentals of our Middle East commitment. She's going to have to finish the campaign against ISIS. I mean, that's not going to be done. Raqqa and Mosul probably will still be in ISIS hands. And I know that she supports the basic outlines of our strategy. We have given this problem, the White House has given this problem to the military. So the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who will remain with the next president, is already forming his strategy for next year. The CENTCOM commander, who just took his job, will be here for 3 more years, is going to be running these wars. So in that sense, you know, presidential elections are big deals, and we have a new leader, but there's a lot of continuity in U.S. policy, just because so much of it is run by professionals in the military and the FBI and the CIA. I mean, those don't change. Those people don't change, and the basic thrust of policy doesn't change.
Thank you very much, David, for your time and for this wonderful talk. नाज़रीन, गुफ्तगू तामदी डेविड इग्नाशियस साहब सां वॉशिंगटन पोस्ट के अंदर असां गुफ्तगू कई अमरीकी फॉरेन पॉलिसी ऐं दुनिया के अंदर जेको मुख़्तलिफ़ जेके इशूज़ आहिनि उन ते असां गुफ्तगू कईसूं। प्रोग्राम जो वक़्तु पूरो थिए थो, पंहिंजे मेज़बान फयाज़ नाइच खे इजाज़त सदाईंदुसि।